spare. Aunt Margo. The next chapter takes a different direction as Harry muses on the fact that the family isn't getting any bigger, that basically his aunts and uncles had all done the business of having children and that they weren't having any more. And in actual fact, it was getting smaller because Princess Margaret and Gangan were both unwell. This is in 2002. What's interesting is he writes, "I didn't know Princess Margaret, whom I called Aunt Margo. She was my great aunt, yes. We shared 12.5% of our DNA. We spent the bigger holidays together, and yet she was almost a total stranger." He explained that he knew of her, and he knew about her fact that her loves had been thwarted by the palace, that there were acts of self-destruction, that apparently there was a hasty marriage, and her husband left poisonous notes around the house describing all the things that were wrong with her, 24 reasons why he hated her. He said he didn't really feel much for her growing up, maybe a bit of pity, a bit of jumpiness, because she was somebody that could kill a houseplant with a scowl, according to him. And he found her very cold. And basically one Christmas, he explains how the mystery was solved with regard to that. And he stood before his pile of presents, which they were opening on Christmas Eve, following the German tradition. And he decides to open the smallest one first, which has a label saying it's from Aunt Margo. And he says thank you to her for it. And inside he finds a biro, and he thanks her for it. And she points out that there's a tiny rubber fish wrapped around it. A fish biro is the gift that he's received. Now, what's really odd is that he obviously receives a really shitty present from his great aunt and labels such behaviour as cold, and then straight after this suggests that he and his aunt actually should have been friends. And this is where we get more of his mentality coming forward, because they've got so much in common, both being spares. And he explained that her relationship with Granny wasn't an exact analogue of mine with Willie, but pretty close. Talks about the rivalry, and also he thought that Aunt Margo wasn't too dissimilar from his mother, both rebels labelled as sirens. And he said that his first thought, when he learned in 2002 about her being unwell, was that he should have got to know her better. And apparently she was unable to care for herself and was being confined to a wheelchair. His words, not mine. And she died on February the 9th, 2002. And he thought this would be a blow to Gangan. And apparently the Queen tried to talk Gangan out of attending the funeral, but Gangan dragged herself out of a sickbay and attended it. And he then talks about the Royal Lodge, and there's a bit of a description about it and some history associated with it. And she was in her own bed and not suffering. And then he explains that days later at Eton, he got a call from a courtier telling him that the Queen Mother had died. Then he's at the funeral, walking slowly behind the gun carriage, bagpipes playing, and he said the sound threw him back in time, understandably so. And it took him back to being on that hideous trek to Westminster Abbey. And he explained that he kept looking at the top of his great-grandmother's coffin and seeing the diamond the size of a cricket ball. And interestingly, he writes as follows: "Not just a diamond, actually, the great diamond of the world, a 105-carat monster called the Koh-i-Noor, largest diamond as seen by human eyes, acquired," and he puts that in inverted commas, "by the British Empire at its zenith, stolen, some thought. I'd heard it was mesmerising, and I heard it was cursed. Men fought for it, died for it, and thus the curse was said to be masculine. Only women were permitted to wear it." So he reflects on relationships there with two members of the royal family passing away. Margo, his great aunt, and of course the Queen Mother. the recollections of it are fairly Spartan. And it's interesting how he seems not to like Aunt Margo, but then, and I think again, these must be the words of the ghostwriter coming through. Because if he's saying, look, I didn't really know her, I was kind of frightened of her. She was an individual that scowled. I knew about her. I knew about the fact that she'd not been allowed to marry the guy that she loved. I knew she had a hasty marriage that didn't go very well. I knew that she ended up in a turbulent marriage because of that. So I knew all of these things about her, but I didn't know her particularly well. And I was almost sort of kind of frightened of her. And she bought me a really shitty Christmas present. She bought me the fish biro. So one could understand that he feels rather distant from her and that he doesn't know her, but then goes on to say, well, we could have been friends. That just doesn't stack up, does it? If he doesn't know her, how would he be friends with her? And what it is really is just another device to try and show the similarities and get back to this narrative of he's the victim, he's the spare, he's the one that's lost out, that he has a turbulent relationship with his brother. So it's regurgitating all of that material, and that's quite clearly coming from the ghostwriter that is dredging that up. But it's an obvious incongruity, as far as I can see, between him suggesting I didn't really know my great aunt Margo, but actually we should have been friends. And of course, attending the funeral, once again, there's the opportunity for him to get back in almost into kind of flashback, and it's bound to remind him of his mother. But it just shows here he is 5 years on from his mother's death, and there's no closure, there's no resolution, there's no catharsis that has occurred. It's still very much raw. And one wonders, it would have been interesting to learn, and again, maybe this is touched on later, but what's he doing about addressing this? He doesn't talk about attendance at therapy, although we know that he has. He's quite prepared to spill the secrets about everybody else. Why not tell us about what's going on in the therapy? Perhaps he does later on, it remains to be seen. But at this juncture, he isn't. And it would seem to me that would be an obvious thing to talk about. To explain, I'd gone into therapy, I was finding it useful, it wasn't helping, what his thoughts and feelings were around all of that. Why is this omitted? Was he not going? Or is it just something that doesn't fit with the narrative now to talk about it? Because it's better to just expose himself as raw and alone and ostracised, and therefore to make it seem like he had no support at all, because that's what fits with the victim narrative, because that is what has to be pushed in order to sell this book. I'd be interested in your thoughts in the comments section. We now move on to more naughtiness by Prince Harry. Join me there.